report.
John Bercow.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to follow the Honourable Lady, the Member for South Swindon, with whom I've jousted in a number of these debates in a very constructive way over a significant period. I'm well aware of her background and of her great interest in these matters. It's a pleasure also for me to be one of the first, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to be able very warmly and sincerely to congratulate the Honourable Lady, the Member for Gateshead East and Washington West, not only on the admirable and heartfelt speech that she delivered to the House this morning, but upon all the work and planning and forethought that have led up to this important occasion. I was pleased to join her and a number of colleagues, as well as representatives of interest groups yesterday evening, to mark the fact of her bill, the occasion of this debate, and the great sense of optimism that her work has produced. I declare an interest again myself, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as the parent of a child with significant special educational needs. My elder son, Oliver, who is 4, has notable speech and language difficulties and was diagnosed last summer on the autistic spectrum. He's a pupil at a mainstream school in central London, where he is receiving quite the most fantastic help in a language unit in what I would describe as a language-rich mainstream school, driven forward through tremendous commitment, vision and inspiration on the part of the head teacher and his senior staff. No parent would ever say, "I'm not worried about my child." We are all concerned about our children. But I confess I feel, and my wife feels, that we're very fortunate that we managed to identify the fact of difficulties at an early stage, to access help, to secure a placement, and to start the process whereby our child is assisted and becomes in the process, and this is important, a much happier little boy than he was for a while or otherwise would have been. So my concern, in fact, is not specifically for my child, but for the vast number of children out there, some of whom, of course, I have encountered in my constituency, as honourable members will have encountered children and parents in theirs, who are simply not receiving the help that they palpably need. With the Honourable Lady, the Member for Stourbridge, I work in the all-party parliamentary group on speech and language difficulties, which I have the privilege of chairing, and I know some members present will also be conscious that I was asked by the government to lead a review of services to children from 0 to 19, children and young people with speech, language and communication needs, with a view to publishing an interim report in March and then a final report in July, suggesting how best we can take forward provision in this field. And I was very happy to agree to undertake that task, because I happen to think that this is one set of issues which need not be a matter of great party political combat, and upon which there is a considerable potential for common ground between public-spirited people of all political persuasions and of none. I welcome the bill because I think that there is, frankly, a knowledge gap. There is an information deficit. Too little is known by too many, and that has been the case for too long. That situation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is unacceptable. If it were to continue, it would represent an abdication of our public responsibility, and that is why the fact that the Honourable Lady for Gateshead East and Washington West has identified this problem and proposed a way forward is so very welcome. What do we know? Well, we know quite a lot, and there is one particular point that I would like at this stage to highlight, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and that is that we all know, talk about and celebrate the priority that should be attached to early intervention. If we take the field in which I have a particular interest, notably speech, language and communication needs, there is a considerable body of evidence to show that early intervention can be hugely effective. Something like 10% of school-age children suffer from speech, language and communication difficulties. If you are able to identify a problem and to help a child before he or she reaches the age of 5 or 5.5 with the speech delay or speech impairment from which he or she suffers, the evidence is clear. That child will have the problem either overcome or very substantially reduced, and he or she will be able to access the national curriculum, access opportunities, access courses, and fulfill his or her potential. The corollary of that point, of course, is that the absence of early intervention is massively damaging. And again, if I think in the field with which I am especially preoccupied, what are the consequences of the failure to identify, to prescribe, and to provide for such children? The answer is a fairly harrowing one, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Emotional and psychological difficulties, behavioural problems, lower educational attainment, poorer qualifications, weaker employment prospects, persistent communication handicap, challenges to mental health, and indeed, in the worst-case scenarios, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and the evidence is on the record to demonstrate this, a descent into criminality. People who don't get help and suffer from untreated communication disorders are more likely to commit crime or indeed to commit crime again and to end up incarcerated. And I'm sure this is a point of great interest to my honourable friend, the member for Blaby, who's sitting on the front bench and I think is motivated to intervene. Oh, my honourable friend wasn't motivated to intervene. He was simply chuntering from a sedentary position on the front bench. But I'm sure that he will take a very close interest in matters that happen to be of enormous importance to this country. And I would like to think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that every member sitting in the chamber is sitting in the chamber because he or she is interested in listening to and possibly making a contribution to the debate rather than engaging in some other activity. So let me say what I happen to think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is incredibly important in this field. When we talk about information not in a vacuum, not information for its own sake, but information as the route to knowledge, as the mechanism for improvement, as the catalyst for change. You take parents. I think there's a great deal to be said for providing a lot more information to parents. Information through health visitors suitably trained. Information through general practitioners suitably trained. Information through teachers suitably trained. Information through children's centres. Information through local education authorities. Information through individual schools. And I confess that a particular gripe that I have heard many a time and oft, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that parents in my constituency have not been able to request a particular service or a place at a given facility for the simple reason, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that you can't ask for something of the existence of which you are unaware. And I know of an outstanding preschool specialist facility in my own constituency called the Puzzle Preschool, which caters to children on the autistic spectrum, run by a woman of almost unbounded talent and commitment, Alex Stania. And she has told me so many times, I can't count how many times, but so many times, that the local education authority, even though it is aware of the existence and of the record of her provision, it's a voluntary sector provider, doesn't tell parents that it exists. That's just one example of how we can either apply existing duties better, and maybe the government needs to look at a change in the regulatory environment or in the means or frequency of information publication so that parents are made aware as they try to negotiate this Kafkaesque process of securing access to equitable provision, what can be made available to them. So that's parental information. Then there is, and I animadverted to it, I suppose, a moment ago, the question of training, to which several members have already referred. And it's training of the whole children's workforce. It is training not only of speech and language therapists in the field which preoccupies me. It is training not only of teachers or of head teachers, but of learning support assistants, of all who are in contact with children. And I think this was a point that the Honourable Lady for Mid-Dorset and Poole referred earlier in her contribution. It seems to me there are two elements to the training offer. One is the question of the availability of the training, and the other is the question of release of the professionals to access it. Looking at the training itself, I think we're all agreed far more needs to be done in terms of special educational needs training, in terms of initial teacher training, most certainly, but also as a continuing professional development. As the Honourable Gentleman Member for Huddersfield observed much earlier in the debate, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think what we have to understand is that training in special educational needs is not an isolated fact. It is a continuous process. It has to go on throughout the career of the professional if it is going to be of appropriate benefit. I am horrified that in the training modules for initial teacher training, the amount of time devoted to special educational needs is lamentably inadequate. You have a situation in which people are training and they get something like half a day induction, which is intended broadly to cover all elements of special educational needs. Now, the Honourable Lady Member of South Swindon was quite right to say we mustn't be unrealistic. You cannot expect that the training modules will inform potential teachers in detail with great opportunity for practical example in every single condition that exists. That is not realistic. And I know there is always great pressure on the teacher training timetable, but I do think far more needs to be done if teachers going into the profession are going to be broadly well informed about the range of problems that exist and of the strategies and devices and sources of support that they can access in order to cope with them in the interests of the child. So that is the... Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He makes a very good point, and indeed, because of the range of different needs, the importance of continuing professional development is key, because it means that if a teacher or a professional working with children comes across a particular special educational need, which perhaps they're not familiar with, they need to be able to access training about that specific need to properly look after and support that child.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. And what I would emphasise in relation to the courses is quite simply this. I think the government is very conscious of the need to build on its existing work and to provide such funding as it can affordably provide to increase training opportunities for people in respect of particular disciplines. That's absolutely right, but there are always two sides to the equation. It's one thing for the government to say, here is the resource, more needs to be done in this field, there isn't sufficient training. It is another to deal with the situation at the local level, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because there is potentially quite a wide range of courses available. But you have to think about other things, as the Honourable Lady quite rightly did in her contribution. Think about the local authority. Are they aware of the importance and potential value of that training? Is there a strategic lead in the local authority upon whose mind its importance has been adequately impressed? You then go down to the school level, and the school might either not know about the importance of it or recognise its value, or alternatively the school might say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's absolutely right, it would be really good for us to be able to access that training for this or that or the other member of our staff, but of course we're very hard pressed, we can't possibly release this person, there will be a shortage. So then you've got to have the backup cover, and that does to an extent cost. But if I may say so to the Minister, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, in the most positive and constructive spirit, this is an area of public policy, in my view, I don't know whether my colleagues will agree with me or not, but it's my view, in which a purely permissive regime is not adequate. It's not good enough simply to say this is what is available and we'll leave it to the individual area to decide whether to pick up on it, because that means that the child, and it is with the child that we have to be concerned, is dependent upon whether there's a far-sighted local bureaucrat or not, whether there is a far-sighted head teacher or not, whether there is a far-sighted class teacher or not. And what I am concerned to establish is that you, to some degree, need to have an element of prescription. You need sometimes to say, this is sound public policy, this is what is required, this is what must be delivered. I give way to the honourable gentleman member for Luton North.
And he's making an excellent speech with which I agree very strongly indeed. The last point, he talked about far-sighted local officers. Are there not some officers, indeed probably many, who are prejudiced in these matters and refuse to take special educational needs seriously because they don't really believe that there's a problem, and they frequently blame possibly poor teaching or poor parenting, when actually there's something that specific to the child which needs to be given proper support.
I entirely agree with the honourable gentleman. I think that rather underlines the point. You have to have certain safeguards, certain guarantees, certain minimum standards. And if I may, I'll move on from the subject of training very briefly to focus on the subject of services. And this is not the occasion for a detailed debate about the precise composition of services, but I do simply make the point that I think it's quite well recognised in the field of special needs that in broad terms there can be said to be categories of provision to reflect categories of need. There are some services that are and should be universally available. There are others that are of targeted application, and there are others still which are specialist in character. So some people with modest difficulties or delays in particular respects can benefit from what we call low dosage, high volume intervention, adequately and more within the mainstream school and the undifferentiated mainstream class within the mainstream school. Some of those services can even be delivered, if not initially, certainly after a while, and with the benefit of the training that I've described, on what we call the consultative model. That is to say, you don't necessarily have to have a specialist there delivering the service, which would be a highly expensive use of resources. There are some children who do require something rather more than the low-dosage, high-volume assistance. They do need targeted help, possibly on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, possibly less, possibly more. They may be in groups or they may be being seen individually. And then there are those categories of children and young people, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who require a specialist service. And I simply say to the government there is a real challenge which my colleagues and I in the Review on Speech and Language and Communication Needs are trying to address, to ensure that we can develop conceptually and then roll out practically a commissioning framework that will allow for the joint commissioning between education and health services, and sometimes between education, health and social services, of the provision that is required specifically and adequately to cater to the needs of children who have what we call low incidence and high need conditions. These are children and young people who have quite severe needs. We were talking, incidentally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, earlier about categories of need, and the Honourable Lady, the member for South Swindon, together with other colleagues, was one who was quick to emphasise that we were not talking about a homogeneous category in talking about the subject of special educational needs, and she was very right to make and underline that point. If I can just add to that very valid point, what I would say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, also is that there is not only a variation between people with mild delay or moderate difficulty and people with severe difficulty, There is a distinction between people who have one problem and people who have several problems. Some special educational needs children have an identifiable condition which might even be severe, but which is easily comprehensible and susceptible to help of a simple and identifiable character. Other children, frankly, do not have one-dimensional difficulties. They have what we call severe and complex needs, which are not one-dimensional, which are, frankly, multifaceted in their nature, and they are probably going to be enduring needs, which will require assistance over a very long period. And I simply say to the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State that over the last few months, visiting institutions all around the country, I have come across the significance of this issue. I've been on visits to schools, preschools, primary schools, secondary schools, post-16 provision in London and in Sussex and in Kent, but also in Middlesbrough and Newcastle and Manchester and Salford and Plymouth, and I'm going to Essex next Monday and Norwich on Wednesday and a host of other places. And one of the things that I have found is that there are some admirable services. This relates to the point so powerfully made by the Honourable Gentleman Member for Luton North, which cater for only a relatively small number of children or young people, which frankly are hugely stretched financially, but the disappearance of which would be a catastrophe for the individual concerned, and indeed, I put it to you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for the country as a whole. Just to give some examples, the Nuffield Speech and Language Unit in Ealing faces a threat to survive. The Michael Palin Centre for Stammering Children, which is, frankly, quite the most outstanding centre you could have the privilege of visiting. Those are just a couple of examples. There are the ACE centres, which cater to the needs of children and young people with cerebral palsy and who require communication aids in order to express their concerns, to offer their opinions, to ensure that their interests are reflected. Now, if those facilities were to disappear, you can be sure of two things. First, once they've gone, they will not come back. And secondly, if they go, you dissipate the expertise, you lose the experience, you no longer have available the teams who can provide training, who can offer outreach, who can upskill the workforce, and who can provide that specialist assessment and diagnosis also that are so often required, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And in that sense, if I may say so, this is a completely non-partisan point. I do feel we should not overdo the rhetoric about localism. Localism has its place. Local differentiation because of the characteristics of the area. Local discretion. Local service entrepreneurs being encouraged to do more or slightly differently or to innovate. That is a healthy phenomenon. But localism mustn't become a religion which poisons the well of public provision or causes policymakers nationally, either deliberately or inadvertently, to abdicate responsibility and simply to say, oh, these are not matters with which it is proper for us to interfere. We are mere ministers, humble specimens who do not presume the expert knowledge. It is a matter purely for the local authority or the primary care trust to determine the configuration of services. And if I may say so, I'm not accusing the honourable gentleman. That, I think, would be a great mistake. You sometimes have to say, this is an outstanding service. It's not a business. It wouldn't survive if it were a matter of commerce. It will be required probably only ever by a minority of children, but it is hugely valuable. It must be maintained. It needs, if anything, to have its facilities extended. And if that means, I'll give way in a moment, if that means that it has to be funded centrally by government, be it a Labour government or a Conservative government, so be it. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Again, agree most strongly with what the honourable member is saying, but there is perhaps a compromise between localism and national provision. And I was suggested in my speech that perhaps consortia of local authorities within a region, so that these specialist facilities can be provided on a larger scale, but will not be too far distant from the families where the children come from. And it's just one way of dealing. They could, indeed, local authorities could be instructed by central government to provide these facilities between them so that we can have perhaps regional provision rather than national provision?
Makes a powerful point. What you need is the opportunity for group purchasing. And it may well be that it can be done on a regional basis or a national basis, but I think it is probably not going to be done in these sorts of cases to which I have referred purely on an individual authority, still less an individual school or an individual parent basis. You've got to have something very much more robust in place than that. I just want to emphasise, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the process of helping children and young people in this field is ongoing, and most of the focus today has very rightly been on children, and in particular, to some extent, young children, perhaps very young children. The government is right to make a priority of helping a great deal at the early stages, because the evidence supports that. And my impression so far is that although there are still significant gaps in provision and plenty of weaknesses to which we will be able, I think, in our forthcoming reports to point, there is progress being made at the preschool and the early primary level. By contrast, I think it's true to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and this is where we need more information as a lever for parents and campaigners to get better services, there is precious little going on in the field of speech, language and communication at secondary level. Far more needs to be done. This is not a failure of one government. It's not a party political matter. It is, frankly, an historic under-recognition, under-investment and under-provision which has taken place over a period of decades. And I think a great deal will have to be done if those children who haven't had the early intervention are not, frankly, to be isolated, failing, unhappy, stranded children in the secondary sector or beyond. I talked earlier about the situation post-16, or at least I referred to it in passing. In the worst instances, people can end up committing offences. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of the 12,000 young people in our young offenders institutions have speech, language and communication difficulties on a scale and of an intensity that prevent them accessing educational or training courses. And so I say to the government, yes, we should frankly be doing more to help those people and not abandoning them. And I've got thoughts on that subject. But even if the government doesn't feel that it can put more money, and I hope it will, into that sector, one thing it could do is say, now wait a minute, some of the money we're spending on these education and training courses is probably not best spent, because some of the young offenders attending those courses are attending on what I call a purely tick-box basis, because they're either obliged or encouraged to do so. They're sitting in on the courses, I've seen them. They don't understand what's taking place. They're not getting a benefit. It isn't causing them to realise their potential. So some, at least, of that resource could perhaps be devoted to speech and language therapy, from which they would derive a recognisable benefit. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. Would he also acknowledge that, as well as speech and language difficulties, that some young offenders and indeed prisoners also have severe and sometimes complex literacy needs, and quite often they are actually dyslexic but have never actually been diagnosed?
And I think, in fact, the statistics on that front are seriously alarming. So it's not just speech and language, expressive speech or receptive language. It can be a much wider set of difficulties that they suffer. Other people have referred to the phenomenon of children suffering from autism. Well, we know that people on the autistic spectrum vary greatly, but they all tend to suffer from what is commonly known in the trade as the triad of impairments: lack of social imagination, social interaction and social communication. And I think it's very important that we train staff so that we don't continue to experience the problem whereby, innocently enough, but very damagingly, professionals in the education sector mistake a disabled child for a disobedient child. And when we talk about people on the autistic spectrum being more likely to be excluded from school, let us be clear, that is what is taking place in so many cases. The professionals don't understand that the child isn't in any sense a conventionally badly behaved child. I think that the understanding even of autism, which is a relatively high-profile condition, is too limited, and we've got to try to stimulate awareness. I was with my young son in a park in central London only a week or two ago, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and my son has particular phobias about a number of things, as often children do, and perhaps particularly autistic children do. He's very anxious about hand dryers. I've always explained to him they can't do him any harm, they're not dangerous, but he hates the sound of the hand dryer. So when we went to take him to the loo, I said to the park keeper, who has to, quite properly, to turn the key and open the loo, would it be okay if my son went into the disabled loo, because I happened to know that there was no hand dryer, whereas in the ordinary loo there was a hand dryer. And she looked completely uncomprehendingly. I make no personal jibe at her, I'm simply making a wider point. She looked completely uncomprehendingly at me and at him, and I repeated the point, and she said, but he's not disabled. And again, there is an issue of understanding, I put it to colleagues here, Mr. Deputy Speaker. People often think that in order to be disabled, someone has to sit in a wheelchair, or lack a limb, or have a very demonstrable and immediately apparent impairment, such as blindness. But actually, children with problems on the autistic spectrum, or children with speech and language and communication impairments, and there's often a close link between the two, can, in some cases, be disabled. So what I conclude by saying to the Minister is this: we need to have a great public debate on special educational needs as a whole. Jim Callaghan initiated such a debate on educational standards in the late 1970s, and that was of enormous benefit to the country in kick-starting the issue of the consideration of provision, the adequacy of standards, the need to develop provision further. I would like to have a great public debate on special educational needs in this country to increase awareness of the issues and to make them very much more important in decision-makers' minds. The challenge is really to bring the issues from the back of ministers, of commentators, of policy-makers, of decision-makers' minds to the front of ministers, decision-makers, commentators and policy-makers' minds. And I simply conclude by saying that over a period, special needs parents have become more demanding, more insistent, more determined to secure better provision. And there will be some cost implications of that. But that is right. We should seize the challenge to improve provision in this field and to make sure that these issues are regarded as part of frontline services and of core provision. Special educational needs must not be relegated into a backroom or a subordinate filing tray as though it is of secondary importance. I think it was Winston Churchill who said you can often judge the quality of a civilization by the way in which the government of a country treats its prisoners. And that was right and far-sighted, as so often with that great man, for its time. If that's true in relation to the treatment of prisoners, and it is, it's true also of the way in which we treat, cater to, and care for children with special educational needs. Whatever else the Honourable Lady, the member for Gateshead East and Washington West, achieves in the course of her parliamentary career, which may include ministerial office of high distinction, I don't know. I wish her very well on her journey. But I don't think she will, in the course of her parliamentary career, do anything more just, more noble, or potentially more appreciated than what she's doing now.
Linda Walther.